Hi everyone, the Australian Constitution. Australia's Constitution is the highest form of law in Australia, to the extent that even Commonwealth Parliament cannot pass legislation which is inconsistent with the Constitution, and that legislation will be struck down by the highest court in Australia, which has original jurisdiction in matters pertaining to the Constitution and interpreting the Constitution, and that is the High Court of Australia. For Australia, our Constitution is set out in one document, the Australian Constitution, which is unlike some countries, for example the United Kingdom, where their Constitution is made up of a series of documents or a series of acts. The Australian Constitution is extremely rigid. As we know, few amendments to the Constitution are successful. In fact, we've only had 8 successful changes to the Constitution since its enactment, and that was out of 44 possible reform initiatives. So the last change to our Constitution occurred in 1977, and as we move towards recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution, we know that there will be some issues around how to change and likely campaigns that need to go with those changes. To change our Constitution, you need a majority of voters in a majority of states. And that really comes back to the drafting of the Constitution and how states who also had their constitutions were very important at the time. State constitutions came about around the 1850s. So they were very keen to ensure that their views were represented at a federal level, and so the ability to change the Constitution is hence compromised. Australia's Constitution does not contain a Bill of Rights, such as in the United States, but there are a number of implied freedoms or rights that we're able to interpret within the Constitution. So our Constitution is unique in that regard. The Australian Constitution was enacted by Section 9 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1900 UK. This brought the Australian Constitution into force from the 1st of January 1901. Our states, as I said, still have their constitutions. I guess the main thing about our Australian Constitution, I do encourage you to take a look at it, I've got a link there on the first page, is that it sets out the 3 branches of government. It's the executive, the legislature, and the Parliament. The executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. The legislature is the Parliament. And it sets out how they came about and sets out many of their legal powers. Importantly, it doesn't set out all their legal powers, but it sets out many of their legal powers. It's not a complete document. As I said, it came about at the end of the 1800s. So things like, for example, televisions, internet weren't conceptualised then. So there is some room to move within the Constitution, but it is a dated document in a sense that requires interpreting by the High Court, and indeed that has happened on many occasions. What's missing from our Constitution? There's no mention in the Constitution of Cabinet or indeed of responsible government, 2 of the cornerstones of our parliamentary system. The responsible government talks about the relationship between the legislature and the executive, and there in your in your reading that David Clark has on e-reserve talks about how these concepts can be defined and how they're represented in an implied sense within our Constitution, even if the language is not there directly. It also doesn't mention the word democracy, which I think is a little bit unusual. Certainly Australia has the reputation of having a strong democracy, and that word is in fact not represented in our Constitution. What is there? Do have a look at the heads of legislative power there, so we know what jurisdiction is allowed to make laws on which particular issue. It sets out the electoral process, talks about voting. I guess that process is the foundation of our representative democracy in Australia. In the section on legislature, it talks about there being several forms of power, that being the Commonwealth Parliament, the state parliaments, which the Commonwealth Parliament being 2 houses, being the Senate and the House of Representatives. At a state level, we often have two chambers also, the exception to that being Queensland, which operates on a unicameral system, and then the 3 territory unicameral legislatures. So these are set out in the heads of legislative power in the Constitution. In the judicial section, or the judiciary section, it's talking about a hierarchy of courts. It sets out that judges should have tenure and also what age they will retire, and talks about judicial power and the nature of judicial power. For our executive, and it's often a clunky term, what is our executive? Our executive consists of our Governor-General at a Commonwealth level, our Governor at a New South Wales level, for example, but at a state level. And consists of the Crown. We are a constitutional monarchy, of course, in Australia. The referendum to become a republic in 1999 was resoundingly defeated. As we know, there is moves afoot to revisit this. And Prime Minister and Ministers are also part of our executive, and then finally our Commonwealth Public Service. So these organs make up our executive, and all of these three branches of government, executive, judiciary and our legislature, are all set out in the Constitution. So do take a look at its scheme, use your effective reading strategies there again, check out the schema and take a look at which laws are governed there. A key one obviously is marriage, which is being debated at the moment. You can see where that power lies. So Australia essentially has a federal system of a government where we have the supremacy of the federal system or Commonwealth Parliament and the Commonwealth Constitution. Indeed, where there is unconstitutional legislation passed by the Parliament, that will be struck down by the High Court on the basis that it's unconstitutional. So the Constitution really is the highest form of law in Australia. We have a distribution of powers across different branches of government and across federal and state levels of government, and we have supreme judicial power in Australia. So those three concepts really encapsulate federalism in Australia. Section 109 is a key provision of the Constitution, which we've covered in previous modules, which talks about that the Commonwealth Parliament will prevail, Commonwealth legislation will prevail to the extent of any consistency, and that really sets up our federal system as reigning supreme. I'll point you to a number of sections which you may wish to read more about or pursue activities on. The Constitution is a key source of Australia. It is the highest law in Australia, so do take a look at it and make yourself au fait with its provisions. Thank you.